When you gaze out across a map of the world, there are few other countries you'll see on it that appear to be more twin-like than the duo of Yemen and Oman. Both countries roughly evenly divide the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula between them. They each have a very similar looking shape, and they're even of very similar sizes, with Yemen being only slightly larger at around the same size as France, while Oman is around the same size as Italy. Neither of them have any permanent rivers flowing in their territory, with both of them being restricted only to seasonal streams known in Arabic as wadis. And yet, despite having no permanent rivers, they also both occupy the two rainiest locations that can be found on the Arabian Peninsula in their upper highland regions. Although, the rainfall levels seen in Yemen are considerably higher than those found in Oman. And in addition to their similar rainfall levels and similar mountainous and desert topography, they both contain similar amounts of geological resources as well. Both countries have a very comparable amount of proven oil and gas reserves, with Oman only having slightly more of each. And both countries occupy strategically important territory that positions themselves at the gates of extremely important global maritime trade routes. Oman controls the valuable territory directly on the southern edge of the Strait of Hormuz that funnels trade routes between the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean, while Yemen controls the similarly valuable territory on the eastern side of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which funnels trade routes between the Suez Canal and the Indian Ocean, which gives both Yemen and Oman a degree of immense geopolitical leverage owing to the spaces on the board that they each occupy. Both countries are inhabited by ethnic Arabs who share a similar language and culture, and both countries overwhelmingly follow the Islamic faith. Sunni Islam is the dominant branch of the faith in each today in terms of raw numbers of followers, though Yemen is home to a very significant Zaidi Shia minority, while Oman is home to a very significant Ibadi minority that has traditionally ruled the country, and which is often considered to be a completely separate branch of the Islamic faith from the more well-known Sunni and the Shia. There are a lot of similarities between Yemen and Oman, not least of which is their shared border that runs for 183 miles or 294 kilometers. And yet, despite all of their similarities and neighboring locations on the map, there are perhaps no other two bordering countries in the entire world today who experience such radically different realities today in the 21st century. Yemen is these days most well known for being essentially the poster child of a failed state. The country has been locked in a devastating civil war for a decade now, ever since 2014, that still doesn't see any end in sight and which has resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. Just last month in March of 2024, the United Nations still described Yemen as experiencing one of the worst humanitarian disasters in the world, with millions of people remaining forcibly displaced from their homes, and with roughly 6 million people remaining on the brink of famine. In reality, Yemen ceased being a functioning country years ago and is more of a geographic expression these days than a real country. Yemen's territory is still divided between multiple different factions and warlords supported by various different outside powers. And many of these factions in control of Yemen's territory are widely recognized internationally as terrorist organizations, such as the Houthis, who control most of the country's population centers, and are considered a terrorist organization by Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Malaysia, and the United States. And there's also Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, or ACAP, who also controls significant territory and is widely considered a terrorist organization by dozens of countries all around the world. Within the past decade alone, Yemen's territory has been bombed by foreign countries from all around the world, and it remains one of the most deeply dangerous and troubled countries on the planet. The Human Development Index, or HDI, is a composite index that combines scores in a country's per capita income, access to education, and access to healthcare to figure out a score between 0 at the lowest and 1 at the highest. Yemen's 2023 HDI score clocked in at an abysmal 0.424, which is literally the 8th lowest score in the entire world, and by far the lowest that can be found anywhere in the world outside of sub-Saharan Africa. And most sub-Saharan African nations are actually doing better than Yemen is according to the HDI. And on top of the abysmal HDI score, Yemen also ranks near the very bottom on the Annual Corruption Perceptions Index for 2023 as well, having come in as the 5th most corrupt country in the entire world, somehow even beating out the corruption score for North Korea. Yemen also has one of the lowest levels of GDP per capita in the world, one of the highest levels of poverty in the world, one of the lowest levels of literacy in the world, especially for Yemeni women, and a whole host of other problems that are genuinely just far too many to even count. Meanwhile, Oman, just right next door across the border, couldn't possibly be any more different. Oman hasn't seen a war fought in its territory for decades since the 1970s. Oman's 2023 HDI score stands at an impressive 0.819. Which is a massive difference between them and Yemen of 0.395 basis points. To put that chasm of a difference in a further perspective, Oman's HDI score is roughly equivalent to Romania, while Yemen's is roughly equivalent to Mali. So imagine if Mali and Romania shared a border between each other. This difference is significantly larger than even the much-discussed HDI difference between Haiti and the Dominican Republic, who share the same island of Hispaniola in the Caribbean, and it's probably a larger gap than even the difference in HDI between North Korea and South Korea. In fact, the difference in HDI score across the border from Yemen to Oman is the second largest HDI disparity between any two borders in the entire world. And it remains only just slightly behind the even larger difference in HDI score across Yemen's other border into Saudi Arabia. There is literally nowhere else on the planet that has as stark of a difference in HDI score immediately across borders as between Yemen and its two neighbors. And it's not just the HDI score that Oman excels over Yemen with. The nominal GDP per capita in Oman is currently a whopping 34 times higher than it is in Yemen, with Yemen's being the 9th lowest in the entire world and Oman's being roughly equivalent to Hungary. Despite Yemen's population being significantly higher than Oman's, and despite Yemen's control of the most agriculturally fertile land in the Arabian Peninsula, and its roughly similar amount of oil and gas resources as Oman, Oman's economy is still more than 5 times larger than Yemen's is. Oman's score in the Corruption Perceptions Index is about on a par with Italy, which is much, much better than being the 5th lowest in the entire world. And the list of differences really just continues to go on from there. Oman is ultimately a stable, prosperous, wealthy, and healthy nation that is notably ruled by one of the very few absolute monarchies remaining in the 21st century, while Yemen is basically an apocalyptic nightmare right next door across the border. So, how did this massive divergence between two otherwise similar-looking countries develop into the way it is today? It didn't just come out of nowhere, and it begins with the slight but notable differences between each of their geographies. A very important component of both of these countries' geographies are their mountains that separate their interiors from their coastlines. In the case of Yemen, their more isolated mountainous highlands enabled the Zaidi Shia Muslim movement to emerge as a distinct religious identity in a region otherwise dominated by the Sunni branch of Islam, while in Oman, the presence of the country's northern mountain chain separates the interior region from a more narrow band of coastal plains immediately butting up against the Arabian Sea. It was within this isolated coastal plain, geographically separated from the rest of the Arabian Peninsula and the Middle East, that a unique Islamic identity took hold that became known as Ibadism, a branch of Islam that is often regarded as being distinctly separate from the larger and more well-known Sunni and Shia branches. The Ibadis, secure in their isolated coastal plain here, developed around the port city of Muscat. And because of their easy access to global maritime trade routes out into the Indian Ocean, they became more commercially focused, outward-looking, and cosmopolitan in nature, which has influenced the Ibadi sect's outlook on religious tolerance and peaceful coexistence with other beliefs for centuries now. The interior of Oman, conversely, grew to become more inward-looking, theocratic, and fundamentalist in nature, not too dissimilar to the pattern seen in modern-day Yemen and Saudi Arabia. In Yemen, the southern coastal areas on the Gulf of Aden grew to also become more outward-looking, trade-oriented, and secular, while the interior mountainous highlands home to the Zaidi Shia movement grew to become more inward-looking and theocratic. Just as in Saudi Arabia, where the coasts were more cosmopolitan and the interior around modern-day Riyadh was the birthplace of the modern-day ultra-conservative Wahhabi movement in Sunni Islam. So Yemen and Oman both struggled for centuries with this difference in geography and outlook between their coastal populations and interior populations, while Yemen's northwestern mountains receive many times more rainfall than anywhere else in Oman or in the Arabian Peninsula. As a result, these mountainous parts of northwestern Yemen are the most agriculturally productive in the Arabian Peninsula anywhere outside of Iraq. And so, they've always been the most densely populated part of Arabia for thousands of years as well. Yemen's agricultural potential is many times higher than that of Oman's, and as a result, Yemen has always had the greater population between them. Even today, Yemen's 2024 population is nearly 35 million people, while Oman has fewer than 5 million, meaning that Yemen has roughly 7 times the population of Oman. But Yemen's much larger population base carries with it certain challenges that have been absent in Oman. In the late 20th century, when large oil and gas reserves were discovered across both of them, it turned out that each had pretty similar amounts, though Oman's were slightly larger. Oman's greatest inherent advantage, however, was that its slightly larger amount of oil and gas reserves were always going to be able to go much further in the way of directly benefiting its much smaller population. It was always going to be easier to have these similar amounts of oil and gas resources benefit the population of Oman, that's just 1/7 of the size of the population in Yemen. And Yemen's population is only expected to continue growing further and further beyond Oman's. Because as the two countries' development destinies diverged radically, so too did each of their fertility rates. Even though Yemen's fertility rate has been continually declining since the late 1980s, it is still today, as of 2023, one of the highest seen anywhere in the world. The average Yemeni woman continues to have 3.6 children during her lifetime. Conversely, Oman's fertility rate has also continually declined since the early 1980s, but at a much faster pace than Yemen's, to the point where today the average Omani woman only has 2.5 children, meaning that with its much larger population base and much higher fertility rate, Yemen's population is going to continue growing multiple times larger than Oman's will. By the midpoint of the century in 2050, Yemen's population is currently projected to reach a staggering 60 million people, while Oman's isn't projected to grow much further than 6 million people, meaning that by then, the Yemeni population will be about 10 times larger than Oman's will be, which simply means that Yemen's limited resources will continue being spread out more thinly than Oman's will have to be. In addition to geographic and demographic differences between the two, there are also very notable historical differences between the two that explain a lot of the current divergence between them as well. Both countries were conquered or colonized by non-Arab powers in the 16th century. The Ottoman Turks took over most of northern Yemen in 1519 and would control it for the next 400 years until the end of World War I, while the Portuguese took over most of modern-day Oman in 1507, just a few years before the Ottomans took over northern Yemen. But the people around Muscat in modern-day Oman managed to push out their foreign occupiers much earlier than the Yemenis did. The Portuguese only stayed around in Oman for about a century and a half until 1650, when local Omani tribes from the interior region managed to push them out and take over Muscat, after which they declared the new Sultanate of Oman. This makes modern Oman the oldest continuously independent state in the Arab world today, having remained largely independent ever since then right up until the modern day. From there, the Omanis utilized their centuries of previous ship and trade experience and everything they learned from the Portuguese to then pursue the Portuguese Empire across the rest of the Indian Ocean. And in the process, the Omanis created a vast maritime empire of their own that at times dominated much of the Arabian Sea and controlled overseas territories in modern-day Iran, Pakistan, India, and all across Eastern Africa, including the strategically important trade hub of Zanzibar. The sprawling Omani Empire was eventually partitioned in 1856 between the northern holdings based around modern-day Oman and the southern holdings based around Zanzibar in Africa. And so the northern half became known as the Sultanate of Muscat in Oman, essentially ruled by a more secular sultan in the coastal plain around Muscat and a more theocratic imam in the interior region. Muscat and Oman eventually became a de facto British protectorate in 1872, but the Sultanate always retained its internal political independence and even ceased being a British protectorate after only a few decades later in 1920, when it received its full independence back. The same wasn't true for Yemen, however, which endured much longer and deeper colonization than Oman ever did. Yemen's densely populated, mountainous, and largely Zaidi Shia northwest was controlled by the Ottomans for centuries until they withdrew from the area after their defeat in World War I in 1918, while the rest of modern-day Yemen was steadily colonized by the British. This other part of modern-day Yemen, without the rain and agriculture of the northwest, is significantly more sparsely populated than the northwest of the country and is largely based around small, dense clusters of civilization on the coast, like in Aden. Most of this territory in Yemen outside of the control of the Ottomans eventually fell under the colonial influence of the British, just like Oman eventually did, but the British came to Yemen much earlier and stayed for much longer than they did in Oman. The British were particularly interested in holding onto the port of Aden in southern Yemen directly, one of the most strategically valuable ports in the entire region, because it's a natural harbor that sits very close by to the Bab el-Mandeb Strait that all traffic between Europe and the Indian Ocean has to use when transiting across the Suez Canal further north. The British therefore directly colonized the city of Aden in 1839, and administered it directly as a colony for more than a century until the 1960s, while the remaining sparsely inhabited hinterlands of southern Yemen were administered as a protectorate, long after the Ottomans withdrew from the north in 1918. The Zaidi Shia of the Yemeni mountains frequently rebelled against Ottoman rule and failed, and so after the Ottomans finally left in 1918 after the last 400 years of control, a theocratic Zaidi Shia religious leader seized power in the vacuum and transformed northern Yemen into a theocratic kingdom that became the precursor of the modern-day Houthi movement in Yemen that we know today. This theocratic kingdom in North Yemen was led by a Zaidi Shia Imam king, who launched frequent failed invasions into the southern British Yemen trying to take it over, while its autocratic Zaidi Shia absolute theocracy had no tolerance for Yemen's other internal religious groups like Sunnis and Jews. This led to mounting unrest within the kingdom, especially among the Sunnis, which culminated with a violent coup d'etat in the kingdom happening in 1962, when Yemeni military officers overthrew the Imam king and attempted to install an Arab nationalist-style republic in its place. The 1962 coup was directly supported by Gamal Abdel Nasser's Arab nationalist government in Egypt, while the deposed monarchy was supported by other monarchies in the region like Saudi Arabia, who were fearful of Arab nationalism and republicanism spreading and toppling their own monarchies in the process. What followed became the first of many devastating modern proxy wars that had been fought in the territory of Yemen, as Egypt threw enormous resources at the nationalist side, including the overseas deployment of 70,000 of their own soldiers to fight, while Saudi Arabia and the other Arab monarchies threw their own resources at the monarchist side. The civil war went on for a brutal 8 years until 1970, and is believed to have killed anywhere between 100,000 and 200,000 people in North Yemen, before the nationalist Republican side eventually emerged victorious and proclaimed the new Yemen Arab Republic, the very first republic to ever appear in an Arabian peninsula that is otherwise completely dominated by monarchy still today. The presence of an independent Arab republic in Yemen and the violent toppling of its monarchy was a precedent that none of the other monarchist powers in the Arabian Peninsula wanted to tolerate or accept. But then, what happened in southern Yemen somehow became even more radical and revolutionary. As the civil war was raging in North Yemen, a group of radical Yemeni communists managed to push out the British from Aden in southern Yemen, and then in 1967, they proclaimed the independent People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, the first and so far only openly communist Marxist-Leninist state to ever emerge in either the Arab world or in the Middle East. By 1970 then, Yemen was divided between an Arab nationalist Republican government in the north and a revolutionary communist government in the south. And so the second proxy war in Yemen of the modern era began as the lines of the Cold War overlapped it. The Americans began supporting the nationalist North Yemen, while the Soviets and the Eastern Bloc began very heavily supporting communist South Yemen, their only solidly communist foothold in the Middle East. The rest of the Arab monarchies, not happy with the way that the Republican government came into being in North Yemen, still ultimately all decided to begrudgingly support it anyway, rather than back the even more radical communist government in the South, that openly wanted to destroy their monarchies in a wave of Marxist revolution for the Arabs. North and South Yemen went on to fight 2 brief wars against each other, and in 1978, a North Yemeni military officer named Ali Abdullah Saleh rose to power as the country's new president after the previous one was assassinated. After rising to power, Saleh then effectively began treating North Yemen as his own and his family's personal property. He was legendarily corrupt and embezzled ungodly amounts of the country's oil and gas wealth and foreign aid for his own personal benefit. He would end up ruling in Yemen for decades after he took over, and in 2012, after he was finally overthrown, a United Nations sanctions panel had concluded that Saleh was able to use embezzlement, extortion, and theft of public funds from the country's fuel subsidy program to rake in approximately $2 billion per year for his own personal gain. By the same time in 2012, it was also estimated by the same UN sanctions panel that Saleh had spent his decades in power quietly amassing a personal fortune for himself, anywhere between 32 and 64 billion US dollars, all hidden away in various offshore bank accounts across at least 20 different countries. This easily made him one of the wealthiest human beings alive anywhere in the world at the time, and all in a country where, at the time back in 2012, the nominal GDP per capita was less than $1,400 a year. To put that into context, Saleh's personal wealth in 2012 could have potentially been nearly twice as large as Yemen's entire GDP was at the same time, because the man had effectively plundered the entire country dry for decades. After the Soviet Union began collapsing in 1990, Moscow cut off all of its subsidies and funding for the communist government in South Yemen, and South Yemen's economy practically imploded overnight without that support. In the aftermath, the powerless government in the south agreed to unify the country with the north and keep North Yemen's Abdullah Saleh as the unified country's head of state going forward. But Saleh immediately began making terrible foreign policy decisions nearly the moment the country was unified. Merely months after Yemen became a unified country, Saddam Hussein ordered the Iraqi army to invade and conquer Kuwait. Saleh then rather foolishly chose to politically support Saddam during the invasion. And after Saddam was decisively defeated and his army destroyed and Kuwait was liberated, Kuwait and Saudi Arabia both decided to immediately end their large amounts of foreign aid that they had previously been giving to Yemen. And on top of that, the Saudis were so infuriated with Saleh's support of Saddam that they expelled more than 850,000 Yemeni guest workers from the country back to Yemen. These hundreds of thousands of Yemenis had been working in the Saudi kingdom, earning higher salaries than what they were capable of back home in Yemen, and they were sending large amounts of the money they were earning back home to Yemen as remittances, which was a huge positive for the Yemeni economy. Their sudden expulsion and exile back to Yemen because of Saleh's foreign policy proved to be a major economic shock to the country at the same time as Yemen was struggling to integrate the South. By acquiring the formerly communist South Yemen, Saleh had increased the amount of oil and gas reserves in his country by roughly fourfold, since the vast majority of the country's oil and gas was in the former South Yemen. And like Germany experienced with the reintegration of the formerly communist East Germany after the end of the Cold War, the newly unified Yemen also struggled to integrate the formerly communist command-style economy in the South into the deeply corrupt and crony capitalist government of the North dominated by Abdullah Saleh. The acquisition of so many more oil and gas reserves in South Yemen was used to essentially line up Saleh's own pockets even further, while the simultaneous shock of the 850,000 Yemenis arriving back in the country all at once from Saudi Arabia, and the further struggles to integrate the South's formerly communist economy, not to mention Saleh's own flagrant and massive corruption, quickly led the recently unified Yemen right back to the breaking point. The South rebelled against Saleh's regime in 1994, only 4 years after the unification of the country happened. And so another brief civil war exploded in the country, and then to help put it down, Saleh began welcoming fighters from what would eventually become Al-Qaeda into the country to fight on his behalf against the South. Al-Qaeda's presence in Yemen eventually morphed into Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, or ACAP, whose presence in Yemen strained Saleh's relationship with the United States, especially after Al-Qaeda bombed an American missile cruiser known as the USS Cole as it was docked in a harbor in Aden in 2000, which killed 17 American sailors. Then after 9/11, Washington took a much more firm line with Saleh's government in Yemen, and so Saleh began switching sides to a more pro-US foreign policy. He allowed the United States to begin conducting drone strikes in Yemen against suspected Al-Qaeda targets, while his public support for Washington enraged many of the more religiously conservative Zaidi Shia Muslims of the mountainous interior. That, combined with Saleh's long autocratic and deeply corrupt rule in the country, and Yemen's long policies of attempted Sunnification of the Zaidi Shia, led to significant unrest mounting beneath the surface that eventually exploded after the 2011 Arab Spring protests began sweeping all across the Middle East. Full-blown revolution erupted in Yemen afterwards, and Abdullah Saleh was finally overthrown from power in early 2012. In the power vacuum that followed, the Zaidi Shia of the northwest largely coalesced under the Houthi movement, and fighting between them and the Sunni tribes in Yemen began that eventually escalated to the point where in 2014, the Houthis marched on the Yemeni capital and seized it by force, and then rapidly took control of the country's government, which led to the devastating Yemeni civil war that has continued on ever since, that has become the third and current proxy war fought in Yemen's territory in recent history. This time between revolutionary, anti-monarchist, theocratic Shia Islamist powers like Iran and Hezbollah, who support the Houthis, and the more status quo monarchist powers like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain, who oppose the Houthis for similar reasons why they opposed the Arab nationalist Republicans in the same area during the civil war of the 1960s. They fear that a revolutionary, anti-monarchist Islamist victory in Yemen that brings a Shiite clerical class into power as a theocracy will become a direct challenge to their own continued monarchical rule. Yemen has been a battlefield for outside powers from all around the world to fight in for more than 60 years now. And while the country was impoverished and struggling before the current civil war began in 2014 due to its many chronic issues, it got much, much worse afterwards. After the first civil war in a united Yemen erupted in 1994, the country's GDP, as measured in current US dollars, proceeded to crash by more than 76% within only 2 years by 1996. It then took the country a decade and a half until 2010 just to recover its GDP from before the civil war in 1994. And then, Yemen's next civil war began only 4 years later after that in 2014, which led the country's economy to crash by another 55% by 2021 as the war continued, while Yemen's oil production levels crashed right alongside the economy by nearly just as much as the civil war intensified. It has since then gotten to the point where in 2023, Yemen has basically become an irrelevant oil producer at only 66th place worldwide, producing even less oil today than Poland does, despite Yemen having 30 times as many oil reserves in their territory as Poland has. And while Yemen has been a hotbed of instability and chaos and foreign interventions for decades, Oman simply hasn't been, and a great deal of why was the very different leadership style that was present in Oman at the same time as Abdullah Saleh ruled in Yemen. Back in 1970, Oman was still just as hopelessly poor as Yemen was and was effectively considered by most of the international community as an isolated medieval-era backwater. The Sultan who ruled the country was an absolute monarch who dominated every facet of the country's existence, to the point where the national treasury was kept in a chest within his own personal palace. After the communists kicked the British out of South Yemen and declared the communist government there, South Yemen began sponsoring a neighboring communist insurgency in the far western Dhofar region of Oman as well. At the time, the then Sultan of Oman was basically an ultra-conservative and eccentric Luddite, who had outlawed virtually all technological development in the country, preferring to keep everything as close to the medieval era as possible, to the detriment of his own people. He also used his absolute authority to outlaw fairly arbitrary things, like speaking to anyone in the country for more than 15 minutes, wearing sunglasses, smoking, and playing football. The Sultan was thus deeply unpopular in Oman as a result, and so, fearful that communism could end up spreading from South Yemen across Oman to replace the Sultan, the British decided to intervene in their former protectorate in 1970 by sponsoring a coup d'etat led by the Sultan's young son, Qaboos bin Said. The coup that followed was entirely bloodless. The Sultan was successfully overthrown and exiled to England while the young Qaboos took over in his place. And, as it turned out, the new Sultan Qaboos was an incredibly competent administrator. While he continued on with a system of absolute monarchy in Oman, with himself remaining as the ultimate political authority, Sultan Qaboos was essentially a 20th and 21st century version of an enlightened monarch like Frederick the Great. He was a reformist who liberalized and revolutionized Oman's society for the benefit of the kingdom's people. He welcomed foreign energy companies like Shell to expand their oil and gas exploration and production in the kingdom, and he heavily reinvested the kingdom's growing oil and gas wealth back into the country itself. When Sultan Qaboos took power in Oman in 1970, the entire country was home to a mere 3 schools, 19 medical facilities, and only 10 kilometers worth of paved roads. Within a decade and a half by 1985, Qaboos utilized the kingdom's oil and gas wealth to build out 500 new schools, 100 new medical facilities, and more than 3,200 kilometers worth of additional paved roads, which greatly increased the development of the nation and the people's quality of life. Qaboos immediately outlawed slavery in Oman when he came to power. He granted women in the kingdom the right to vote, and he established a brand new parliament that consisted of elected officials to support the monarchy. He used this rapid development of the kingdom and the support of British and Iranian troops deployed by the Shah to quell the communist rebellion in the Dhofar province. And as the country's wealth was continually reinvested into the country's development, and the people's living standards continued rising, the level of remaining unrest began to evaporate. Far from plundering the country of its resources and wealth dry like Abdullah Saleh did in Yemen, Sultan Qaboos poured his nation's wealth into developing the kingdom for the benefit of the people, and sunk billions of dollars into diversifying the country's economy away from oil and gas to open up other major economic sectors like tourism. Qaboos's strategy of modernization was so enormously effective in Oman that in 2010, the United Nations bestowed Oman with the honor of being first in the entire world for the advancement of their HDI score over the past 40 years, surpassing even the much more well-publicized example of China. Oman's oil and gas production rates continued increasing in this environment of stability, as foreign companies found it more prudent to invest in comparison to the basket case in neighboring Yemen. Sultan Qaboos was also insistent on a forward-looking policy that he called Omanization in the kingdom's oil and gas industry. That is, the foreign energy companies that set up operations in Oman would have to hire local Omani workers and give them working experience in the industry so that, over time, Oman would be able to reduce their reliance on foreign employees and companies and begin taking over control of more and more of the kingdom's oil and gas for themselves. Oman also simply didn't have the long history of divided rule between separate regions of the country the same way that Yemen did, where Yemen had been divided between an Ottoman north and a British south for more than a century, and then between a nationalist north and a communist south for decades until the 1990s. Oman had remained a mostly unified nation for centuries and had been free of Britain's protectorate for decades. Oman didn't have to reintegrate a communist society and economic system the same way that Yemen needed to do, while Sultan Qaboos went further and enshrined a policy of religious tolerance within Oman. While he himself and most of the ruling class in Oman followed the Ibadi branch of Islam, all of his subjects were granted religious freedom and were allowed to mostly follow whatever they wanted. A policy that was again very separate from the deeply sectarian politics over in nearby Yemen that frequently pitted the country's Zaidi Shia community up against the Sunni community. And alongside Sultan Qaboos's policy of reinvesting the country's oil wealth back into the country to further the pace of development and modernization, he also began pursuing a rather unique foreign policy in the region that complemented his domestic strategy of stability very well. Whereas Yemen was frequently the site of various proxy wars all throughout its history, and Abdullah Saleh pursued an interventionist foreign policy that frequently got him and Yemen into trouble, like supporting Saddam's invasion of Kuwait and then working with al-Qaeda and later with the United States, Sultan Qaboos put Oman down the path of radical neutrality in the dangerous neighborhood of the Middle East. Part of this strategy was aided by geography. Because of Oman's northern mountain range, the population core of the kingdom around the capital Muscat has always been isolated and separated from the rest of the Middle East. The political dominance of the Ibadi branch of the Islamic faith in Oman has always been unique in the context of the greater Muslim world, and has put it apart from every other Muslim country that is politically or demographically dominated by the much larger Sunni or Shia branches instead. This naturally set the Omani Sultanate up to become the go-to mediator in disputes all across the region between the Sunni and the Shia. Because, as a separate Ibadi-ruled state, they could be viewed by both Sunni and Shia as a true neutral party. Sultan Qaboos wielded this perceived neutrality of the Ibadi sect to then effectively transform Oman into the Switzerland of the Middle East. He led Oman into continuing relations with the Ayatollahs of Iran after the Islamic Revolution overthrew the Shah in 1979. He led Oman to become the very first Gulf Arab state to welcome an Israeli prime minister in 1994, Yitzhak Rabin. In the 21st century, when the Saudis sent tanks rolling across their bridge into the island kingdom of Bahrain in 2011 to put down a popular Shiite revolution there against the kingdom's Sunni-led monarchy, Oman continued to remain neutral. When the Houthis overran the Yemeni capital and most of the country's population centers in 2014, and the Saudis created a military coalition in 2015 to intervene in Yemen against them, Oman once again chose to remain neutral in the war. And the following year in 2016, when diplomatic relations between Saudi Arabia and Qatar broke down over a number of issues and the Saudis began championing a blockade and embargo of Qatar, Oman once again still chose to remain neutral. By remaining neutral in all of the multiple conflicts in the Middle East, and advancing itself as the go-to mediator in all of the region's numerous disputes, Oman was able to safeguard its own stability in a dangerous neighborhood even further and cemented itself as a highly valuable geopolitical asset. And by doing so, it also made itself an indispensable ally and friend to just about every single one of its neighbors. And that further cemented Oman's value to perhaps their greatest supporter, the United States. Washington found Oman's friendly relations with every country in the Middle East to be especially useful. So much so that during the Obama administration, Oman was the site of high-level diplomatic talks between the Americans and Iranians that led to the so-called Iran nuclear deal between them in 2015. Oman has hosted American troops in their country for decades now out of the airbase RAFO Thumrait in the Dhofar region, an airbase that the U.S. Air Force has used to support operations in Iraq and Afghanistan for decades now. Oman's value to Washington is considered to be so great that ever since 2009, the United States has maintained a comprehensive free trade agreement with Oman, one of only 20 nations worldwide that the U.S. has these kinds of trade agreements with. Sultan Qaboos ruled his kingdom for nearly 50 years continually, from 1970 when he overthrew his father to his death in 2020 just a few years ago. During that time, he oversaw Oman's complete transformation from an isolated medieval backwater into a modern developed 21st century nation. Oman's GDP per capita was a paltry $382 per person adjusted for inflation when he took the throne back in 1970, which was about on a par with sub-Saharan African nations at the time like Zambia and Zimbabwe. Within 2 years of his death by 2022, the nation's inflation-adjusted GDP per capita had increased by more than 65 times over to more than $25,000 per person. He introduced the nation's first political constitution in 1996, and for decades throughout his rule, he undertook an annual tour of his kingdom to visit with his own people and hear about their concerns directly. His twin foreign policy of extreme neutrality and his domestic policy of rapid reinvestment and development transformed Oman into a wealthy bastion of stability in the sea of chaos in the Middle East. And though he was an absolute monarch who banned opposing political parties and ran what has sometimes been described as a benevolent police state, Sultan Qaboos was generally a beloved champion of the Omani people. When the Arab Spring swept unrest across the region in 2011, protests broke out in Oman just as they did elsewhere, but Sultan Qaboos immediately addressed them with a promise to create more jobs and boost incomes. He opened up the government's finances for the benefit of his people over himself, and the protests quieted down and quickly went away. His decades of forward-looking and prudent leadership in Oman contrasts extremely sharply with that of Abdullah Saleh's decades of rule in neighboring Yemen, which were spent effectively plundering the country for his own personal benefit that awarded him no affection when unrest came to Yemen after 2011 too. And after the Sultan's death in 2020, his forward-looking and sound policies appear to have continued under the reign of his cousin and the current Sultan, Haytham bin Tariq. Oman's decades of stability and rising oil and gas output and rising economy attracted further foreign investment into the country, which enabled Oman to extend its oil and gas production and exports even further and earn even more money. In the process, though, Oman also transformed into effectively a petrostate. Oil and gas currently represents 64% of the country's export revenue, 45% of the government's income, and half of its entire GDP. This has exposed Oman to economic shocks whenever the global price of oil decreases, which is partially what sparked protests in the kingdom in the 2010s. But the country has been aggressively investing into diversifying itself away from oil by building out alternative economic sectors. Like most of the other Gulf states, Oman has been particularly trying to build out a robust tourism industry for itself. In 2023, the kingdom welcomed more than 4 million tourists to the country, and Oman currently has about $6 billion worth of tourism-related investments in dozens of projects currently on the table to expand their tourism sector even further. Meanwhile, Yemen is frequently considered as one of, if not the, most dangerous countries in the world to visit. And so the country has virtually zero tourism, and this only further compounds Oman's economic advantages over Yemen. The two neighboring countries have also diverged over time in another very notable way as well. They're radically different uses of their scarce water and agriculture. While Yemen indeed has the most agriculturally productive land in the Arabian Peninsula, it has been very inefficiently used for decades now to produce a plant known as khat. Khat is a mildly narcotic plant that, when chewed, releases natural stimulants to the person chewing, and its use has fairly recently become a very widespread phenomenon across Yemen. In 2007, the United Nations conducted a specific report on the nature of khat chewing in Yemen and found that as recently as the 1960s, the chewing of khat was only an occasional pastime in the country that was largely enjoyed only by the rich. From there, however, khat chewing somehow spread across Yemen to become a virtually ubiquitous hobby. The 2007 UN study concluded that a whopping 72% of men in Yemen and 33% of women chewed khat regularly, with many chewing it every day. It concluded that more than 1 in 5 khat users in Yemen spent more than 6 hours a day chewing it, while more than 93% of users spent more than 2 hours a day chewing it, which takes away productivity from the workplace all across the country and negatively impacts the Yemeni economy even further than everything else already does. The wide-scale cultivation of khat for this large-scale domestic consumption within Yemen has also crowded out the nation's valuable and limited agricultural land and supplanted the cultivation of more valuable cash crops that Yemen used to export for revenue, like coffee and fruits. Khat production in Yemen is almost entirely consumed within Yemen. And because khat is a very water-intensive crop to grow, the cultivation of khat in Yemen is currently believed to consume a massive 30% of the entire country's limited supply of irrigation water. The ubiquitous consumption of khat in Yemen therefore increases the country's poverty even further, as it makes workers less economically productive, consumes huge amounts of the country's increasingly scarce water supply, and crowds out the growing of other crops that would be more valuable to export in its place. Meanwhile, while caught chewing is incredibly common in Yemen, it is severely illegal in other nearby Arab states. Caught smuggling is punishable by up to life imprisonment in the United Arab Emirates, while in Oman, it is even punishable by the death penalty. Caught chewing is therefore an almost completely absent hobby in Oman, as are all of caught associated negative economic effects that are present in Yemen. And ultimately, these are the many, many reasons why Oman is just in a much better place than Yemen is today. It is the result of decades of diverging policies and leadership in the two countries that have resulted in wildly different institutions and realities emerging in both of them. And as the civil war in Yemen continues on, and as the Houthis continue inviting international outsiders like the US and UK to intervene with their attacks on maritime shipping in the region, the divergence between Oman and Yemen is likely only going to continue growing even further with time. It will take a massive shift in Yemen's leadership and fortunes to bring about true change. But that doesn't appear to be on the horizon anytime soon. Since October of 2023, when the war between Israel and Hamas began, the Houthis in Yemen have attacked more than 60 vessels in and around the Red Sea, and hundreds of merchant vessels from all around the world have been forced to reroute away from the Suez Canal around the southern tip of Africa. And despite US and UK bombing strikes being initiated against their positions, the Houthi attacks have been getting even more dangerous recently. In late February, the Houthis fired an anti-ship ballistic missile at a cargo ship that was transporting fertilizer through the Red Sea called the Ruby Mar. The missile impacted the ship and caused catastrophic damage to it. Enough so that the entire crew was forced to drop anchor and abandon ship before the entire thing sunk beneath the waves of the Red Sea a few days later, becoming the first maritime vessel that the Houthis have destroyed in the Red Sea since the Israel-Hamas war began. And then, just a few days after it sunk in early March, the Houthis fired another missile at another cargo ship in the Gulf of Aden that struck and killed 3 of the crew members on board, representing the first lives lost in the Houthis' campaign of targeting merchant shipping in the Red Sea. In response to these increased deadly attacks, the US and UK have increased their bombing strikes on the Houthis in Yemen. And after the 4th round of US and UK airstrikes were launched against them in late February, the story got picked up and covered by 253 different news sources, and their reporting on it was fairly evenly split by bias. But if you compare the headlines, you'll start to see something pretty interesting in some of the framing. From this left-leaning source, you have a headline saying, US and UK carry out new attacks on Yemen, without any mention of the Houthis or the nuanced situation in Yemen at all. And then from this right-leaning source, you have a headline saying, US-UK launch new wave of strikes against Iranian-backed Houthi terrorists, explicitly labeling the Houthis as a terrorist organization, which is not an internationally agreed-upon consensus. And this is why I've been using this video's sponsor, Ground News, to research issues in a way that lets me see past these kinds of partisan spins. It's a website and app designed by a former NASA engineer on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, objective way to read and parse the news. Every story comes with a quick visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality, and ownership of the sources reporting, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organizations. And you can directly compare related articles from different sources to see what details are being emphasized, exaggerated, or left out. One of my favorite features is their My News Bias feature, which tracks your reading habits over time. It's basically a dashboard for your news diet, showing you what your top news sources are, whether you engage with different perspectives, what topics you're interested in, and a lot more. I also really like their blind spot feed, which highlights stories that are being disproportionately covered by one side of the political spectrum. This feature recently showed me that if you lean left, you likely would have missed out on this story about a fellow YouTuber going by the name Your Fellow Arab, who recently traveled to Haiti and got himself kidnapped for a $600,000 ransom while trying to interview the country's most notorious gang leader. Since only 14% of the reporting on it has come from left-leaning sources, while 71% of it has come from right-leaning sources. And conversely, if you lean right, you likely would have missed out on this story about an AP investigation that revealed how black people in America bear a disproportionate impact of police violence, since only 6% of the reporting on it has come from the right and 56% of it has come from the left. I really strongly believe that it's super important we understand how our current partisan media environment operates, and the impact that it might have on our politics, so that we can engage in constructive dialogue, break out of unproductive echo chambers, and maybe even challenge some of our own assumptions in the process. And best of all, they're currently offering 40% off of the Ground News Vantage plan, which gives you unlimited access to all of their features, including the awesome My News Bias. So go to ground.news/reallifelore or click the button here on screen or follow the link down below in the description to subscribe for only $5 a month and help an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent. And as always, thank you so much for watching.